Five Nights at Freddy's is a new Blumhouse horror film based on the video game franchise. It stars Josh Hutcherson as a security guard who's looking for a job, so he gets hired by Shaggy to work as a night shift guard in an abandoned Chuck E. Cheese knockoff, and he discovers the mysteries of what goes on in there after dark. So, my history with the FNAF franchise is that I don't have history with it. I've never played any of the games. I don't even really know what happens in them. I just know it has to do with animatronics coming to life. My incredibly small knowledge of the game series comes mostly from memes. Hey kid, why do you phone? We tell but notice that you're home alone. The amount of presence it has on the internet and how obnoxious it is made me not have interest in checking it out. Same goes for Fortnite and Among Us and Rick and Morty. I felt like it was being overhyped, plus they've released so many of these in the 9 years of its existence, and there are books too? What is even going on? With that being said, I was still willing to watch the film adaptation just because I was curious to see how it would work as a horror movie. Before this, the closest thing we got to a FNAF movie was Willy's Wonderland, starring Nicolas Cage. I haven't seen this movie, but I assume not a lot of people saw it as it's never really talked about, despite releasing only 2 years ago. Understandable since it does look pretty forgettable, which is something that can easily be said about the actual FNAF movie, which was in production for 8 years. I was expecting it to be one of two things, either really bad to the point where I could at least have fun with it, or a pleasantly surprising experience. It ended up being neither. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is one of the most boring movies I have seen this year. I'm often okay with watching movies, good or bad, because it's interesting to look at what worked and what could have been improved. But this is a case where I felt like I was wasting my time. But anyway, I'll talk about the one thing I liked. The animatronics are impressive. They're made by Jim Henson's Creature Shop, though, so that's to be expected. These costumes look like they came straight out of the games. I'm glad they didn't do what Hollywood typically does by changing designs for the heck of it, or using CGI. This was an aspect that I thought they really cared about, knowing how recognizable these characters are and how important they are to the franchise and to a lot of people. So anyway, this aside from that, they were extremely underutilized. We barely get to see them doing any killing. There's only one scene where we get a pretty cool and somewhat brutal killing scene, but they decided to not do that again. Most of it happens off screen, and that's kinda disappointing. Despite being a horror movie, there's not much horror going on. There's a few jump scares, but they don't have any effect. These animatronics don't give off a menacing vibe. Most of the time we see them, it's while they're befriending Josh Hutcherson and the little girl as a way of tricking them. This leads to a major tone shift, plus the audience already knows what will happen later on, so this just seems like a waste of time. Speaking of humans, they're not any better. Most of the focus is on Josh Hutcherson's character as he's dealing with a traumatic past involving his brother getting kidnapped. Not much comes from it, and he barely goes through any kind of arc. There are multiple instances where we see different versions of the flashback, and it really gets repetitive. Josh Hutcherson is usually a good actor, but he looked really bored during a lot of scenes. His struggle with trying to take care of his sister doesn't add much to the overall narrative. They didn't need to add this attempt at an emotional storyline. It's not the slightest bit interesting. The other characters aren't any better. Matthew Lillard tries his best, but his character is wasted. Then there's also this police lady, who has significance in the story later on, which I won't give away, but she's written to where her goals are unclear, making the twist feel lazily handled. She's a very pointless character who only serves as an exposition dump. Other than that, she doesn't have any actual character to her, lacking any kind of personality. And yes, there is a twist followed by another one, though it's not really a twist since most of the audience already knew about it a year in advance. I won't say it in case you don't know since the movie still portrays it as a twist. It feels unearned and just a way to make fans of the games happy. There was no build up to it since we don't spend a lot of time with this individual. It makes it hard to care. It doesn't allow for a satisfying payoff. It just makes this climax come out of nowhere. We don't know the motivation behind it. Would have been fine if we had at least seen how much of a threat we were dealing with, but much of the movie chooses to just tell us instead of showing us. This is about someone kidnapping children and putting their corpses into suits. But we don't see that actually happening. It's clear that the movie is trying very hard to keep its PG-13 rating, understandable since they want most of the game's target audience to watch it. but this is one of those cases where I think it could have benefited from having an R rating. It really holds back on what should be darker moments. The tone is there, but they don't go through with it enough. But even with a PG-13 rating, there are ways to make it work, and they almost did it in that one scene that I mentioned earlier. It just wasn't executed that well. I'm not sure how they managed to make this feel too long while also making it feel too short. There are certain moments that feel dragged out instead of getting to the point, but there are also aspects that aren't fleshed out, making the overall experience seem meaningless. It's okay for a movie to be for fans, but they should give something for newcomers as well, similar to the Mario movie that released earlier this year. It's not a bad movie, but I also stated there that it's a fun film for Mario fans, but it doesn't work that well as a movie. Like I said, I've never played FNAF, so any references to the game is lost on me. There are clear moments where you can tell they want to get a reaction out of the crowd. They played a Living Tombstone song in the credits, and there's a certain YouTuber cameo who I almost didn't recognize until he said his famous catchphrase. But I can't say that it's something that I can just have fun with. This is a movie that is clearly trying to take itself seriously, making some of the more ridiculous moments stick out like a sore thumb. Nearly everyone is playing the role as straight as possible, but the whole thing just didn't work out. I was hoping this would surprise me because there were other surprises this year. This could have been something that was somewhat decent, but it failed miserably. It doesn't feel like a movie. It just feels like a product that they wanted to make just to cash in on a popular video game. I can see why this was released on Peacock at the same time. It's not worth watching in theaters, even though I myself watched it in theaters. But giving it a dual release doesn't seem to be affecting its box office numbers, so a sequel is inevitable. There is potential for a sequel as long as they learn from the mistakes that were made here. It could actually be something of worth. The Five Nights at Freddy's movie is a terrible horror movie and a terrible video game adaptation. It lacks any kind of scares and has a bunch of story problems. I don't recommend watching it in theaters unless you're a big fan of the games. If you're just really curious, you might as well watch it on Peacock. I know FNAF fans seem to enjoy it, but if you're looking for a good horror movie with strong writing, then Five Nights at Freddy's is not where you want to be.